Today, I'd like to talk to you about the first part of a new project I'm currently working on that examines the social, cultural, and personal elements in mathematician lives and how do they affect the trajectory of the research and the subject matter of their theories. So specifically, as you can see from the title, I'd like to focus on Intuitionism, which was a philosophical mathematical school of thought that was developed at the beginning of the 20th century by the Dutch mathematician Lloyd and Hilbert and Brouwer. And I would also like to note that, as Edward mentioned, this research is supported by the Rivalry Fellowship and the European Union. So let's start with a very brief and incomplete historiography or biography of Brouwer. So Brouwer was born in the small town of Overschie in the Netherlands, and by 1907 he finished his PhD dissertation titled On the Foundations of Mathematics under his supervisor Deirdre Korteweg. Now, Brouwer was constantly contemplating about whether to choose a mathematical course of studies or a philosophical one. And until 1904, he did his master's both in philosophy and in mathematics. But under the influence of Korteweg, he eventually chose to take a more mathematical path, and he finished his dissertation in mathematics, which is important to the rest of our story. The years between 1909 and 1913 are considered a very productive period in Brouwer's work. He founds modern topology as a chapter of classical mathematics while also continuing to develop his intuitionistic work. In 1913, he was appointed as a professor in the University of Amsterdam, succeeding Deirdre Korteweg. And in 1914, he accepts an invitation to join as one of the editors, the editorial board of the mathematician Annalen, which was the most prestigious and renowned journal of mathematics at the time. Now, the period between 1920 and the 1930s is what is commonly known as the foundational crisis or the foundational debate. I'll say something about it in a second. In 1922, he co-founds and established, together with another mentor of his, Gary Kmennery, the Significs Circle, which is a social movement that dealt with the connection between mathematics, language, and society. The circle was working between 1922 and 1926, and in 1928, Brouwer gets fired from the mathematician Annalen, a move that was initiated by his so-called nemesis, David Hilbert, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. In the 1930s, the debate starts to wave out, and the period between 1933 and 1942 is a period where Brouwer paused all his intuitionistic work, and he only resumes his publications and his work in Intuitionism in 1946 in a series of lectures he delivered at the University of Cambridge, which basically described the whole intuitionistic view that Brouwer held all the way from his dissertation until 1946, and this later developed into an edited book in the 1990s. Now, in 1948, he resumes his intuitionistic work or his foundational program with the notion of the creating subject, and in 1955, after having a world tour of invited and serious lectures, starting with Cambridge, but also going through MIT, Chicago, Miami, I think, Dublin, Vienna, and Cambridge, as I mentioned. He publishes his last new intuitionistic paper, and a decade after that, in 1966, Brouwer passed away. Now, before proceeding into focusing on the specific story of Brouwer, let me say a few words about the debate that occupied some of the great mathematicians in Europe at the time. So around the turn of the 20th century, evolved a strong resistance to Cantor's set theory due to several acute problems. Now, some of these problems were technical in their nature, and even Cantor acknowledged their existence. Brouwer's dissertation, written in 1907, echoes this resistance to some extent, and we can think about his motivation in writing this dissertation as some sort of a response against Cantor's set theory. Now, what we see here is a histogram taken from Dennis Hasseling's group, Gnomes in the Fog. And in this histogram, we see all the public reactions to Intuitionism from 1907 until 1933. So we can see that in the first decade, between 1907 and the 1920s, there is fairly a low amount of reaction to Intuitionism, except of two spikes. We see one in 1913 when Brouwer gave a public lecture about Intuitionism and formalism, and another one in 1915 when a translation of this lecture was translated into English by Arnold Dresden, and this and got into pushed into the US. Brouwer's work up until then was written only in Dutch, so it was only within the German Göttingen circle that actually read and discussed these works. In 1921, Hermann Weyl, a central figure in mathematics, publishes his advocating paper of Intuitionism. Now, it has been claimed that Hermann Weyl's paper basically put Intuitionism on the map, and it actually was the fact that Hermann Weyl was David Hilbert's most prominent student, who was, again, the nemesis to some extent. Yeah, it's a caricature, okay? But just to be clear, his position was completely opposed to Brouwer's own views regarding the foundational debate, and the fact that his most prominent student, Hermann Weyl, converts to Intuitionism, did a lot of echoes within the mathematical community, and basically put Brouwer's Intuitionism on the foundational map. And you see that there are many responses to Intuitionism, relatively many responses. And by 1931, Arndt Hating publishes a series of papers that formalizes Intuitionism. So he creates a formalized system of intuitionistic ideas, completely against what Brouwer thought of Intuitionism. And from that point onwards, Intuitionism continued to develop, but it was mainly under the formalizing act of Arndt Hating, and not so much as building on the contours of Brouwer's Intuitionism. So in the 1940s and in the 1950s, we see a development of Intuitionism that extends the formalization of Intuitionism, for example, done by George Kreisel and John Mayhew. And we see that in the 70s, Intuitionism kind of regains attention from the philosophical community, this time very much due to the work of Michael Dammett on meaning, language, and interpretation. So what's Brouwer's Intuitionism about? The major cornerstone of Brouwer's Intuitionism, again, a very sketchy kind of way. So according to Brouwer, mathematics is a creation of the mind, in the sense that mathematical existence equals a mental construction. So according to Brouwer, we have an inner notion of tuity, which basically is our ability to understand unity and to add to it another unity. And after having this notion of tuity, we can add another unity to it and another unity to it. So we can constructively build, for example, the series of the natural numbers. And this constructive kind of way is the only way that Brouwer accepts of doing any kind of mathematics. So mathematical proofs must be constructed in a constructive kind of way. So, for example, proofs of existence by negation, for example, are no longer considered legitimate objects in Brouwer's Intuitionism. Now, according to Brouwer, mathematical objects must be finitely graspable, so there is no actual infinity. We can talk about potential infinity, again, by adding a unity and a unity and a unity, and so on, until we can think about a potential infinity, but we cannot talk about actual infinity in the sense that we cannot perform any mathematical actions on it. We cannot add infinity. We cannot do anything that goes within Cantor's set theoretical work on infinity. This is also problematic a little bit. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you like. And one of the cornerstones of Brouwer's intuition is that mathematics is a languageless activity, in the sense that we use language to convey mathematical idea, but those ideas exist without any need for language itself. So according to Brouwer, language actually reduces our ability to understand pure mathematics. According to Brouwer, there are also no in principle unknowable truth, in the sense that what is truth will eventually be knowable to any intuitionistic mind. And intuition is the only ground for certain knowledge, according to Brouwer's intuitionism. So the self is the source of knowledge, and any epistemic assertion that exists must exist through the self. Now, given that, it's pretty understandable why scholars connected intuitionism to solipsism, according to which knowledge of anything outside one's mind is unsure. In today's talk, what I'd like to do is to challenge this assumption. And I'd like to do that by focusing on the communal and social aspects of Brouwer's intuitionism. So the first thing that I'd like to do today is to show that these aspects exist, that Brouwer was concerned about the role of mathematics in society, and he was concerned about how people practicing mathematics affected the use and content of mathematics itself. What I'd also like to do as a second goal is to explore what can we learn from the existence of these social aspects. So one thing that I'd like to think about is what insights can those aspects provide us about the narrative of the development of Brouwer's intuitionism. And the second thing I'd like to think about is what can they teach us about the subject matter of Brouwer's mathematics. Now, eventually, this will support the disconnection between Brouwer's intuitionism and solipsism, but this is not the main goal. My main goal is to reveal a new layer of Brouwer's intuitionism, the social layer, which has not been discussed yet. So let's start with fleshing out those aspects. So the first place, the best place to start exploring Brouwer's engagement with those social aspects is to understand his engagement with the Significs movement. So what are the Significs? The Significs is a term that was coined by Victoria Lady Welby. She was a self-educated British philosopher, and she published in 1896 a paper titled Sense, Meaning, and Interpretation, which you can see basically here. She suggested in this paper a theory that focuses on science as means to improve communication and eventually solve social problems. Now, in 1908, the Significs idea was first brought to the Netherlands by Frederick van Eden. However, van Eden published a paper that discusses the Signific study without actually acknowledging the work of Lady Welby and without actually referring to her Significs theory as it was written in 1896. 4 years later, in 1912, Jacob de Haan publishes another paper in the Netherlands titled New Philosophy of Legal Language. And here he acknowledges Lady Welby and her theory of science. And this is basically established the Significs as some sort of a resource to study in the Netherlands. In 1917, Van Eden, De Haan, Brouwer, and Gerrit Mannery, together with three other colleagues, established the International Academy for Practical Philosophy and Sociology. It also included Henry Burrell, physicist Leonard Ornstein, and H.P.J. Bloomer. And in 1922, after De Haan left the group and Van Diniken joined instead of him, the group changed its name to the Signific Circle. And the Signific Circle met regularly between the years 1922 and 1926. It engaged with questions connecting mathematics, language, and society. And part of its dialogues were actually written down and were even translated into English in the Significs Dialogue, which was published in 1937 as 3 parts in the Synthese journal. So the basic goal of the Significs movement and the new academy, as Brouwer saw it, was to better understand how individuals' ideas can find their way into the commons and thus magnify what he thought was their social impact. Now, as Brouwer himself stated in his prospectus of the Significs movement, the undersigned hold the opinion that when the same task could be undertaken in common by a group of independent thinkers with subtle and pure human feelings, their thoughts formed in the mutual understanding of their circle would necessarily find a corresponding language, allowing them to enter into the mutual understanding of the multitude. It must be kept in mind that a thought in its quality of embryonic deed has a far greater possibility of development when it is the common intimate conviction of a group of human beings than in the case of its belonging to one individual only. Now, Brouwer's specific choice of words, specifically as he highlights that scientists' thoughts are formed in the mutual understanding of the groups, suggests that at the very least, he noticed a difference between individualistic work and collective work, acknowledging the benefits of the latter. So when a group of individuals forms an idea, It enables them to enter the mutual understanding of the commons in a much more effective way than individualistic thinking does. Put differently, since thoughts are shaped by the thinker or thinkers, group thinking makes thoughts shareable because they are the product of a collective mind. Now, as a result, ideas can evolve and prosper much better when cultivated in a group mode rather than in the mind of one individual. Now, this sort of statement basically supports the idea that a group or community or collective holds the key to creating and spreading knowledge, which is a very atypical thing for a solipsist to say. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most influential characters in Brouwer's life was Gerrit Mannery. Now, Mannery was basically the leader and the co-founder of both the Academy and the Signific Social movement. He was a mathematician without any formal education, but this nevertheless did not stand in his way of obtaining a professor position in 1917 in the University of Amsterdam. He was also a Marxist and a political activist, and he believed in breaking paradigms and giving blows to the authority. He also believed that language is the most important element in understanding human behavior and mathematics, which is very unlike Brouwer's own views. Now, what we see here is a dialogue, a documented dialogue between Brouwer and Mannery as a part of the Significs Circle. The dialogue actually occurred in 1922, but the reference here is from the dialogues when they were published in 1937. So Brouwer claims here that true mathematics never lacks significance because it is never without a social cause. Men come to think mathematically because only by applying this method of thinking was he able to prevail in the struggle for life, which became more and more complicated and difficult. For that, Mannery challenges him and asks, okay, yet mathematics is cultivated to a large extent as l'art pour l'art, and then the formal structure does grow quite independently of social aims. And for that, Brouwer answers, I'm not so sure of that. Mathematical thought, or rather mathematical sentiment, is a sort of network connecting the data which are necessary or valuable for our life. A formula and perhaps even a calculating rule, as long as it is manipulated, really has an asserting character in many more cases than would follow from Mannery's ideas. And I think even that the formula borrows its only importance from that asserting character. Now, this is an interesting and rather undiscussed quote of Brouwer, implying that Brouwer did not think that mathematics can be practiced without a social cause. Now, according to Brouwer, the significance of a mathematical formula derives from its asserting characters, which is constituted by the formula being manipulated or operated by members of the community. Now, similar to Brouwer's remarks on group thinking in the previous slide, this exchange of words with Mannery indicates that Brouwer ascribed to people or the community a significant role in shaping mathematical knowledge. Now, to illustrate the idea of a manipulation or the asserting character of a formula, Brouwer gives the interesting example of a bookkeeper at a bank. He says, the banker sends an important telegram. This is living. This is asserting language. The code words in which it is written form what I call a sequence of entities, which represents another sequence of perceptions and unattained aims. In other words, there are as many links between the ultimate aims and the nearest means. If now the content of the telegram is reproduced in the bookkeeping, it does not lose that character, but it becomes only more difficult to perceive the connections between the means and the aims. The sequence of entities is transformed. For the bookkeeper, this connection is then dissolved into a general feeling that he has consciously performed his duty, a feeling that is positively akin to the sentiment that constitutes for the mathematicians the notion of truth. So the code words in the banker's telegram represent what Brouwer calls asserting language, in the sense that these words carry connections to other aims and means of the bank itself. Now, when these words are reproduced in different circumstances, tracing the connections becomes much more challenging since the context of these words has now changed. Now, the analogy to mathematics, according to Brouwer, is that mathematical expressions and formulas are part of our everyday language, and individuals acquire them in certain specific social circumstances. The process of acquisition and the social context differs between different individuals, thereby affecting the way those individuals use and manipulate these formulas. But once they did use these formulas or did some sort of a mathematical manipulation, they get a sense that resemble the feelings mathematicians get when they move one step closer to the truth. Now, the notion of truth is also something that Brouwer addressed in its social context. He says, for me, truth is a general emotional phenomenon, which can be coupled or not with the formalistic study of mathematics. And therefore, I do not recognize as true, hence as mathematics, everything that can be written down in symbols according to certain rules. Conversely, I can conceive mathematical truth which can never be fixed down in any system of formulas. Again, just as in the administration of the bank, on the one hand, it is quite possible to falsify the books through hitting all the rules of the art of bookkeeping. On the other hand, it is impossible to enter into the books all the considerations of the banker and all the other factors, social factors, that influence the financial power of the bank. Now, first of all, what we see here is that Brouwer makes clear that just as mathematical formulas cannot be reduced to linguistic symbols without losing at least some of their essence, so does mathematical truth. Now, the essence of mathematical expressions and formulas is rooted, according to Brouwer, in the accompanying elements of the entity. For example, these elements can be the social context, the environment, and other personal, individual, cultural contexts in which it was used or learned. Now, the same is true for mathematical truth. The phenomenon of truth is too general to be accurately articulated in linguistic symbols, since, resorting again to the example of the banker, it is impossible to account for all the considerations and all the other factors that influence the concept of mathematical truth. So what we've seen so far are some strong evidence for a communal trend in Brouwer's thought regarding the social context of mathematical elements. A trend that completely opposes the solipsistic views we mentioned earlier. So from a historical perspective, there is a tension between these two trends. We can also talk about that in the Q&A. And this tension is basically the focal point that I would like to focus our attention to. So at this point, there are two routes that we can take. The first is to focus on specific events in Brouwer's life and ask, for example, how the social, political, and personal events shape the development of Brouwer's Intuitionism. The second path we can take focuses on the subject matter of Brouwer's mathematical intuitionism and asks how do these social aspects affect the content, the mathematics itself of Brouwer's intuitionism. Now, one path is more historical in its nature, and the second is much more philosophical, but both of them build on Brouwer's engagement with the social world, and each of them reinforces, in a somewhat different way, the idea that we should consider his engagement with the Signific Circle much more seriously. So let's start exploring the first path, focusing on the development of Brouwer's intuitionism and how a specific social event has shaped it. Now, one of the most interesting and intriguing incidents that was political in its nature and also personal and had a tremendous effect on Brouwer's life and work was the mathematician Annalen incident, which I hinted to again in our first slide. So starting from the end, by 1928, you can see that Brouwer was serving now for 14 years as part of the editorial board of the mathematician Annalen. You can see his name over there. Again, to be a part of the editorial board of the Annalen is considered a huge honor among mathematicians. It has a saying says that you've established your way into mathematical community. We consider you as one of our members, okay? Like getting a job, for example, in the academy. And we can see here that in 1929, we no longer see Brouwer's name on the Annalen, neither as an editor nor as anyone of the editorial board. And this was very much due to the undertaking of another mathematician, David Hilbert. Now, you can see here the content of the letter Hilbert sent to Brouwer. It's translated by Dirk van Dalen, basically announcing his dismissal from the Annalen editorial board. Dear colleague, because it is not possible for me to cooperate with you given the incompatibility of our views on fundamental matters, I have asked the members of the board of managing editors of the Annalen for the authorization which was given to me to inform you that henceforth we will forego your cooperation in the editing of the Annalen and thus delete your name from the title page. At the same time, I thank you in the name of the editors for the Annalen for the past activities. Respectfully, yours, David Hilbert. Now, the reasons that Hilbert gives for dismissing Brouwer in this letter specifically are incompatible views regarding the fundamental issues in mathematics. But their relationship is much more complicated than that. It actually started with the mutual respect, specifically from the young Brouwer to his 20 years older fellow mathematician. In a letter Brouwer wrote in 1909, he even refers to Hilbert as the first mathematician of the world. In the next couple of years, between 1910 and 1920, the relationship remained friendly to this extent, and Hilbert even wrote Brouwer a letter of recommendation for his position in the University of Amsterdam. And in 1919, Hilbert even offered Brouwer a chair in Göttingen, which Brouwer turned down. Now, during the 1920s, as the foundational debate started to get more and more heated, their relationship started to turn sideways. In 1927 and 1928, Brouwer gave two big lectures where he criticized Hilbert's formalism, and this was the blow to the relationship. And from that point onwards, the personal and mathematical turned into one and affected their relationship on a very sideways kind of manner. Now, in order to dismiss Brouwer, who was an associate editor, from the editorial board, Hilbert had to get the support of the other chief editors, which were Felix Klein, Otto Blumenthal, and Albert Einstein. Now, in a letter Hilbert wrote to Einstein, he was very explicit about the reasons why he wanted Brouwer out the door. Just for some misunderstanding and further ado, which are totally superfluous under the present circumstances, I would like to point out that my decision to belong under no circumstances to the same board of editors as Brouwer is firm and unalterable. To explain my request, I would like to put forward briefly the following. 1. Brouwer has, in particular by means of his final circular letter to German mathematicians before Bologna, insulted me, and, as I believe, the majority of German mathematicians. 2, in particular, because of his strikingly hostile position vis-a-vis sympathetic foreign mathematicians, he is, in particular in the present time, remember that this is during the time between the two world wars, unsuitable to participate in the editing of the mathematician Annalen. I would like to keep in the servant of the founders, Felix Klein. Now, Einstein did not find Hilbert's reasons very convincing, even though Einstein himself was not a big fan of Brouwer. I consider himself, Brouwer, with all due respect to his mind, a psychopath. However, it is my opinion that it is neither objectively justified nor appropriate to undertake anything against him. If you cannot bring yourself to this because his behavior gets too much on your nerves, for God's sake, do what you have to do. I myself cannot sign for the above reasons such a letter. Now, in a private letter to Max Born, Einstein admits that he thinks Hilbert overreacted. Objectively, I might briefly point out that in my opinion, there would have been much more painless remedies against an overly large influence of the managing of the Annalen by the somewhat mad Brouwer than eviction from the editorial board. This, however, I only say to you in private, and I do not intend to plunge as a champion into this frog-mice battle with another paper lens. Now, the frog-mice battle, or the war of the frog and the mice, is of course a reference to the comic epic from the Iliad, commonly attributed to the Greek poet Homer. It's also the title of Dirk van Dalen's paper on the topic, one of the very few papers that actually analyzes and deals with this very interesting Brouwer-Hilbert conflict. Now, Hilbert's justifications obfuscate some of the real and deeper philosophical differences between the two. Hilbert thought that Brouwer was undermining mathematics and that his intuitionistic endeavor will eventually bring mathematics to its bitter end. So both the personal and the philosophical agendas are in play here. Now, the plot thickens as Hilbert was unable to actually persuade all the chief editors to fire Brouwer. The matter then turned into a legal affair involving the representative from the Springer editorial publishing house and their lawyers. And eventually, they decided that Brouwer should be fired. And this ordeal has tremendously affected Brouwer's work. From 1928 onwards, Brouwer refrains from publishing in the Annalen and convinces his student, Arend Hating, to do the same. In this histogram, we can see that up until 1921, Brouwer publishes every year an impressive amount of papers, and a significant portion of them was published in the Annalen. So the red one marks the Annalen publication, and the blue one are others, and the total amount is the accumulation of the two. But after the Annalen incident, Brouwer ceased to publish almost completely. For over a decade, we see some hinges here and there. And it's only in 1948 that he returns to the scene for a short while to introduce his work on the creating subject. So Brouwer actually never regained the energy to promote Intuitionism as he did before, and his subsequent publications contributed very little to the further development of Intuitionism. So from, as you saw in the other histogram by Hesseling before, from 1935 onwards, Intuitionism basically shifted, and the development of Intuitionism, and there were a lot of developments to Intuitionism, were basically developments of Hayting's Intuitionism, of Hayting's formalized work, and not of Brouwer's Intuitionism. So we see that the personal conflict between Brouwer and Hilbert, which occurred during a political turmoil in the larger social context, demonstrates here how the political, the social, and the personal blend together and eventually affect the development of Brouwer's intuitionistic work. Let's now turn to examine the impact of social views on the content of Brouwer's intuitionism. One place where these views comes into play is the idea of the creating subject. Now, the creating subject is an idea that Brouwer introduced in 1948 after his long pause from publishing after the Annalen incident. And it has been claimed that for Brouwer, it was a radically new approach and that it was the closest thing to a psychological interpretation of mathematics. Now, the creating subject is an idealized subject who can, by itself, do any mathematics that can in principle be done, and whose activity can be structured as an omega sequence. Okay, so remember we talked a little bit about potential, actual, infinity. So we can talk about omega sequences because we can construct all the natural numbers and understand what is a potential infinity. So only finite sequences of the ordinal omega are relevant here. The creating subject does not have any time or space limitation, nor does it ever make mistakes. Or as Anne puts it, we may think of ourselves as we should like to be. Now, the creating subject has the ability to look back at its earlier activity. It can actually reflect on its past activities and project an initial segment of those omega sequences, for example, the natural numbers, onto its earlier acts, which basically means that he doesn't forget anything. It can also do that again and again and again in the future, which basically means now that the creating subject holds the accumulation of knowledge that exists. Now, the creating subject can also generate choice sequences, which are some of the most important and complicated mathematical entities of Brouwer's intuitionism. This might be the motivation behind Brouwer's introduction of the creating subject, which is a natural successor of Brouwer's counterexamples, and it yields much stronger results. Now, along the years, several philosophers and mathematicians have tried to develop a theory of the creating subject and tried to formalize it. So in 1967, George Crazel introduced the following axioms, marked here as CS1 until CS3. We start with a basic notion, the first one up there, with the square NA, which denotes that the creating subject has a proof of A at time n. Now, the first axiom says that at each stage, it can be determined whether or not A has been proved. So we can decide whether the creating subject has a proof of A or has not. The second axiom says that the creating subject never forgets. Remember that he does not have any limitation of time or space or anything else. And the third axiom, or mostly his second conjunct, is known as the axiom of Christian charity, which basically means that there are no, in principle, unknowable truths. Now, in 1969, mathematician Anne strengthened the third axiom to claim that the creating subject only proves what is true, and what is true will be proved by the creating subject at some point. Now, there are many challenges against the first and second axioms, but the third axiom is the most controversial one. And some scholars claim that it is not acceptable from a constructivist point of view, such as Bohr and Solholm. And Gödel's incompleteness theorem, for example, even implies that under some circumstances, the principle is actually false. But what's important to our story is what exactly does this creating subject refers to. According to Juke Nikos, there is no idealized subject in Brouwer's notion of the creating subject. There's only us, human beings, and Brouwer refers to either I or we when he talks about the creating subject. According to Brouwer's view, mathematics is a creation of the human mind, and by using the expression creating subject, Brouwer only made explicit his idealistic position. It can be replaced by we or I. Interpreted in this way, an idealist mathematician is not needed at all for the reconstruction. We interpreted the expression creating subject as we, and anybody else can interpret it as himself. Brouwer's definition is a description of a construction, as any intuitionistic definition, but the construction is not completely determined. The values of the sequence under construction depend on the mathematical experience of the maker of the sequence, which is the creating subject. So according to Nikos, there is no idealized mathematicians, but a real, actual human being mathematician doing all this work and experiencing all these experiences. Now, philosopher Karl Pozzi agrees to some extent with Nikos' position and even takes it one step further in terms of its communal dimension. I'm assuming an inter-subjective notion of the creating subject, distinct mathematicians addressing distinct issues. The third and the strengthening of the third axioms show that this differs inessentially from so-called solipsistic versions. In practice, creating subject arguments assumes only that we can track the outputs of research on particular problems or the status of knowledge about particular objects. We might, in fact, be tracking the entire mathematical community. So Pozzi's approach here not only distances the creating subject for a solipsistic, from a solipsistic point of view, but it brings out the idea of intersubjectivity into the discussion and even the mathematical community. Now, if we think back about Brouwer's own remarks from the Significs Dialogues about the role of the community in asserting the character of mathematical formulas and shaping knowledge, such an interpretation suggests another link connecting the social activities of Brouwer and the content of his Intuitionism. The knowledge the creating subject holds is the accumulating knowledge of the entire community. This means that the community not only reflects the knowledge that exists, but it also uses it, constitutes it, and creates it. However, in a different paper titled Consciousness, Philosophy and Mathematics, published in 1949, Brouwer is somewhat enigmatic in terms of his solipsistic views. So on the one hand, he argues that there can be no proof of the existence of other minds. There is no plurality of mind, so much the less is there a science of the plural mind. However, he also claims that in the same paper, by so-called exchange of thought with another being, the subject only touches the outer wall of an automata. This can hardly be called mutual understanding. Only through the sensation of the other's soul, sometimes a deeper approach is experienced. Now, this quote, the second quote, is revealing the potential for other people's autonomous existence, and thus it can be interpreted by some of Brouwer's scholars as a way out of solipsism. So, which one is it? This is the interesting point. There are several views regarding Brouwer's approach to solipsism in his work on the creating subject, and each of them holds somewhat different interpretation. For example, mathematician Ant Roelstra, who was a student of Arend Hating, who was a student of Brouwer, claims that a reconstruction which would be based on the solipsistic explanation of the creative subject seems to us to be undoubtedly anachronistic. Arend Hating claims that Brouwer had sometimes described mathematics as an activity of the mathematical community as a whole. Now, Arend Hating, which is his views on intersubjectivity and the communal aspects of mathematics are an entirely different story that is interesting in its own, but he himself held his own views regarding the role intersubjectivity plays in the individual's lives. So, for example, in 1978, Hating claims that the individual cannot be separated from the culture where he lives. And in another quote, he asks, "Why am I convinced of the existence of Japan? Well, because I have been taught so at school and imagine that some men there perceive things as I myself perceive my environment." Here, intersubjectivity is going to play a big role. So what we see here is that later developments of Intuitionism, mostly those by Hating and his students, clearly take into account the intersubjective aspect. And some scholars even believe that we see evidence of that in Brouwer's own mathematical thinking. So to conclude, what I've tried to show you here so far is that, first of all, there is a connection in Brouwer's thought between mathematics and social events. And the Significs Dialogues have proven to be a very resourceful resource for finding such links. Now, these links imply a tension between Brouwer's communal trend of thought and his solipsistic view. Now, as we saw, this tension actually resides in the foundations of Brouwer's mathematics, and it paves its path into the understanding of the creating subject, which sound on its very own very solipsistic, but can be understood in a non-solipsistic way. So if we look closely on Brouwer's mathematics, there isn't actually anything in the mathematics itself that requires solipsism. So the tension may now be a little bit dissolved into what we can call vagueness, perhaps. So the important thing here is to understand that Brouwer's Intuitionism has a social aspect which has not been discussed before. These social aspects affect both the historical narrative of the development of Intuitionism and also the philosophical grounds of his Intuitionism, and we can see this, for example, in his work of the creating subject. Thank you.